Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among its citizens. Those are the words of Justice John Marshall Harlan. Today, I'm joined by Coleman Hughes, the author of a powerful, indeed a courageous new book, The End of Race Politics: Arguments for a Colorblind America. Coleman is a writer, podcaster, and opinion columnist who writes about issues related to race, public policy, applied ethics. His writing has been featured in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, many, many other publications, and he's a regular contributor at CNN and the Free Press. And a few years ago, he was included in the Forbes 30 Under 30. Welcome, Coleman. It's a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure to be here.
I've been following your work for many years, and I'm pleased to talk about your book. When it came out, I saw an announcement. I think it was on Twitter. It's coming soon, so I rushed to get an advance copy to read it. And I wanted to dive in just to get on the table what your claim is. So maybe a few decades ago, the idea of color blindness would not have been as controversial as it is today. And in effect, people, when they hear color blindness, they process it very differently. So I wanted to get a read from you. Why is that? How do you understand color blindness, and why has it come to have such a bad reputation today?
As you pointed out, if you go back to, say, the late 60s, the days of the high classical civil rights movement, almost everyone who wasn't a Jim Crow segregationist would have agreed that color blindness is the end goal. In other words, we want to get to a point in society where a person's race, a person's skin color is considered totally irrelevant. It's not just the civil rights leaders that would have agreed with this at the time. Even the book Black Power, the manifesto of the movement of the same name, acknowledged that ultimately the end goal should be colorblindness, and we can disagree about how best to get there. And those were quite considered to be quite radical activists. In the past 50 years, partly due to the influence of critical race theory, which was a conscious attack on colorblindness, a departure from the philosophy of the civil rights movement, even in its self concept. The influence of critical race theory spread throughout the academy and throughout the wider culture. The influence of intellectuals and writers like Robin DiAngelo, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram Kendi, and others, all of whom take the basic thesis from critical race theory that colorblindness is not the way to go, that it's naive, it's a Trojan horse for white supremacy, and it's not up to the task of fighting racism. This has become essentially the dominant view on the left and among progressives. And part of it is that colorblindness is seen as ineffective. The argument is that colorblindness basically hasn't achieved anything in the past 50 years. We still have racial inequality of outcome. And therefore, what we have to do is, inject race into every public policy, state, local, and federal. Even this is the most extreme version, that we need to distribute COVID emergency aid to restaurants based on aid. We need to distribute antivirals based on aid, as was recommended by the governor of New York during COVID. So that's in a nutshell how it came to be that colorblindness used to be agreed upon by everyone, and now it's seen as the enemy.
And one thing that I was interested to learn from your book, that the idea of color blindness goes back even farther. It has its roots in the abolitionist movement. Can you share a bit about that context? I think that will be surprising to people.
Yeah, so there's a narrative that's emerged today that colorblindness is somehow a conservative idea. The idea is that it came from the neoconservative think tanks in the 1970s, people like Nathan Glazer, Daniel Bell, and so forth. This is a total false history, a rewriting of the history of color blindness done by its enemies. The truth of the matter is that the earliest mentions of color blindness that I'm aware of actually go back to the 19th century, to Wendell Phillips. Wendell Phillips was a staunch abolitionist He was a friend of William Lloyd Garrison. He actually took over the presidency of the American Anti-Slavery Society from William Lloyd Garrison because William Lloyd Garrison thought that basically the movement's mission was done once slavery was abolished, but Phillips wanted to continue it until black people had full equal rights, including voting rights. So, in other words, this was a man too radical for William Lloyd Garrison, one of the, if not the most famous abolitionist in American history. And the earliest mentions of the term colorblindness come from him, where he is proposing a 14th Amendment, which hadn't yet been written. He's proposing a 14th Amendment that made the quote a government colorblind, which is to say a government that cannot see or distinguish between different races of human beings. And that's actually where colorblindness comes from, not from the conservative movement or the neoconservative movement, but from the most radical abolitionists that wanted to go beyond simply abolishing slavery in the 1860s and 70s.
Now, when you write about this topic, and it really bears emphasis just how controversial this has become. I've heard people say this, and I've read about it, and we've talked about it in our other episodes. When people hear color blindness now as an ideal or as something to aspire to, they take it to mean that it's like a self-delusional position. Like, you don't see color. I just see people in some generic sense. And what I take from your book is that that's not really what it's about. It's about putting an individual's character as at the forefront versus some unchosen feature of their identity. And in a sense, it's race, or at least people's color or sort of cultural features. Those are real things, but it's not the deciding factor about how we think about people. Is that resonant with how you view this?
Yeah, and I blame the misunderstanding in part on people on my side of the issue. People say things like, I don't see color. And understandably, that's a confusing phrase because you do see color, right? Everyone who watches this video can see that I'm black, and not white and not Asian and so forth, right? So to say I don't see color, inevitably, people feel gaslit on the other side of the issue because you're claiming not to be able to see race. You're claiming not to be able to even be capable of racism, which is, I think, also misleading and the wrong approach. I think whenever someone is tempted to say that, I think they should instead say, I try to treat people without regard to race. I try my very best to treat my friends, my employees, my colleagues without regard to their race. The point of colorblindness is not to pretend that you can't see race. We all see race, and we're all even capable of being biased, just like we're capable of being selfish or capable of being, any number of human flaws. The point of colorblindness is to see race but disregard it as a reason to treat anyone differently. The idea is you notice that I'm black, but you're not going to treat me differently than you would any other guest on this show. That's what colorblindness means. And that's what we have to find again if we're going to manage as a multiracial democracy for the next several hundred years. We have to find that as our North Star. We have to find that as the ethic to teach our children, if we want to encourage racial harmony in this diverse and increasingly diverse nation.
Now, a couple of things that come up in the book I wanted to draw out. One, you said this earlier in the conversation, that you characterize the people who are opposing color blindness or who tarnish its name. They do it consciously, or there's an agenda there, and they characterize themselves somewhat confusingly for many people as anti-racists. And in the book, you come out really strongly criticizing that. So how do you understand the individuals and intellectuals behind anti-racism? How do you differentiate yourself from that perspective?
There's this redefinition of racism that has been going on since the 60s, but has gotten more and more popular, which is to say that racism equals prejudice plus power. That's the second part of that that's important, because the idea is that Black people don't have power, therefore, Black people and people of color in general can't be racist towards white people. Only white people can be racist towards people of color. Now, this is very convenient if you're a person of color because it lets you off the hook for anything heinous you may say or do to white people because it, by definition, can't be racist. Very convenient. Problem is, that was not the definition of racism that Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin and civil rights leaders were fighting. In fact, I think Martin Luther King defined racism in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, as, quote, the doctrine of congenital inferiority of a people. Racism, for Dr. King, he said multiple times that black supremacy would be equally evil as white supremacy. The version of racism that was fought in the March on Washington and at Selma was the idea that any group of people is congenitally inferior to any other group of people. That can go in any direction. It can go from white people to black people to white people, Asians to Hispanics, Hispanics to Jews, etc. It can go in any direction, and we should fight it any direction that it goes. We should not define it such that only certain races of people can definitionally be racist to others. Now, what's happened with the modern anti-racist movement, the so-called anti-racist movement, which I take aim at mostly because their books have been the most popular examples of it. I take aim at Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo in particular. But they stand in for a larger way of thinking. They stand in for an anti-racist movement that essentially claims to be a continuation of Martin Luther King, but has completely changed the contents of the philosophy. Instead of defining racism as something that any group of people can point at any other group of people, it defines racism as something only white people are capable of. And in doing so, it allows not only for racist rhetoric against white people to be tolerated, it allows for racist policies against white people to be tolerated in the name of anti-racism. In the book, I give many, many examples from Sarah Jeong at the New York Times to a lady by the last name of Kililani at Yale, who have just said basically the worst racist things you could possibly say about any group about white people. But nothing happens, right? There's no censure for them. There's their institutions back them essentially. I give examples in chapter 3 of policies from emergency racial triage policies during COVID to affirmative action and so on and so forth. Policies that openly discriminate against white people in the name of sort of balancing out history, and rather than be called what they are, which is racist by any by the old definition, let's say, by the Martin Luther King definition, they are called anti-racist. So the anti-racist movement. It's not just not true; it's the opposite of the truth. It actually endorses racism. It endorses racial stereotypes. It endorses racial discrimination, and it has cleverly rebranded itself as anti-racist. And it's amazing. It's like a company that keeps the label and just changes the product on the inside.
I wanted to turn to what I've been following your commentary on this, and I saw that you were invited to speak at TED late last year. It came out. You had a talk on colorblindness, and I was surprised to see what actually happened with that. So there's, I think of it as a kind of scandal, but the reason I want to talk about it is it struck me as a kind of barometer or an indicator of the state of affairs, or the openness to the idea of colorblindness, or rather the closed attitude that many people have to it. So maybe you could give us sort of a thumbnail sketch of what happened with your experience at TED, and how do you think of it?
So if people want the long version, they can look up my piece at the Free Press where I give the detailed blow by blow. The short version is that I was invited to TED to give a talk this past year on colorblindness, the topic of the book. I gave the talk, and there was a swift and intense backlash among a small number of employees at TED. And those employees actually didn't want to publish my talk at all. And what ended up happening is they ended up publishing my talk nominally on their website, but intentionally under promoting my talk so that it had really a tiny fraction of the views of every other TED talk, to an extent that it just was not plausible. They ended up essentially sandbagging the talk online because so many of their employees wanted to thwart me, essentially. And I went public about this in the free press. And what happened is there was a classic Streisand effect, which is when you try to suppress something, and that's the fact you try to suppress it comes out, it ends up backfiring, and more people end up seeing the thing than ever would have seen it had you just treated it normally. And so that's what ended up happening. And I think TED ended up coming under a lot of warranted criticism for sort of claiming to be this space for open ideas, but suppressing a talk that about a talk expressing a view that is widely held by Americans. To be pro colorblindness is not a fringe viewpoint. Um, you probably won't hear Democrats on the national level support it, but if you actually poll Democrats, it's still broadly popular among Democrats. That's why a state like California can have a plebiscite, two plebiscites in my lifetime about affirmative action, both of which come out anti affirmative action in a blue state that's also highly diverse. So the fact that TED had such trouble sort of treating me fairly as a very non fringe viewpoint on the race issue became a perfect indicator of how these elite spaces like TED, elite institutions, have uh, allowed themselves to enter a bubble where certain ideas are so controversial there that are actually widely held by the public. And I think it also unintentionally, because I truly have nothing against TED as an organization, and I still don't. But I think it unleashed a whole undercurrent of people that have been mad at TED for years for moving in a more woke, for lack of a better word, a more woke direction. And I think my going public about that story became kind of a lightning rod for pent up anger at TED over the years, and I think it became bigger than I intended it to be as a result.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you wrote about, correct me if I'm misremembering this, as part of having you on stage, they wanted to have someone come on, and there was another debate that was arranged as a part of the deal to ensure this would happen. And all of those seemed like those are either ad hoc or very unusual things for them to do in trying to deal with your position fairly. Am I remembering that accurately?
Yes, the first idea was to attach a debate to the end of my TED talk in one video. And I didn't agree to this because I it was sending the signal and the message that my TED talk can't be heard on its own. My TED talk has to be heard with the opposing viewpoint, and it can't be taken down without a chaser, so to speak. And I thought that's precisely the wrong signal to send. Part of why I um, wrote this book is not just because I'm endlessly fascinated by the topic of race. I'm actually quite bored by the topic of race because I don't think a person's race tells you much of anything about them. Part of why I wrote this book is because I want it to become more acceptable to have the viewpoint that I have, because I know that there's a huge slice of people out there who essentially agree with my philosophy about race, live out the colorblind philosophy in their own lives with their friends and their family and so forth, but just cannot talk about this publicly for fear of getting canceled. So part of my project is not simply an academic fascination with the subject, but also to try to make it more okay to talk about this subject and to say, I try not to, I try to treat people without regard to race, and I want race out of my public policy. If you want to do public policy based on income, if you want to help the poor, sign me up. I'm all for that, but I'm not for judging people on the basis of their skin color. So I want to make that more acceptable. To that end, it doesn't really serve me if I'm putting out this TED talk out there with a warning label like, "Hey, this is a super controversial idea. Swim at your own risk," etc. So I didn't agree to that, and eventually I did agree to a debate to be released 2 weeks after the TED talk was released, and that's how we ended up finding a compromise.
I want to just pause for a moment and just ask you uh, to hear about your perspective on something I shared with you before the conversation, to see, one, if you'd read it, and two, what your reactions to it are. So my views on race have been influenced significantly by John McWhorter's work and others. And one of the other influences on me, and the namesake of our organization, is Ayn Rand. And part of what I get from Ayn Rand is the perspective on the positive view of individuals as unique and valuing them individually, not by any unchosen features and so on. And I was curious to see if she wrote on the issue of racism when it was cresting in the public awareness in 1963. I shared that with you. I was curious if you had any reactions to that, any thoughts, because my assumption was that there would be points of contact and maybe some common ground on her analysis of racism and yours. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I actually hadn't read that essay by Ayn Rand in 1963 until you sent it to me, and I was fascinated by it for two reasons. So first, let me just say I think her argument is spot on. Her argument being that uh, racism, racism at the end of the day, it is a rejection of individualism because you are by definition judging an individual by the traits or the perceived traits of their group. Nobody chooses who they're born into. Nobody experiences being the average member of any group they belong to. You only ever experience being the person you in fact are. Does me no good that the average man is 5'9". I'm going to live my whole life 5'7". That's how that works with respect to every trait that we have. It doesn't matter what the average income of my race is. I have the exact income I have, and that's my reality. I have the exact intelligence I have, the character I have, and so forth. And so to prejudge me based on what you think are the average or typical traits of my race is a rejection of the individual. And Ayn Rand, as a staunch individualist, took that strong position against racism. And the first half of the essay, she's mostly talking about racism against blacks in particular. It was also interesting. The second half of the essay, she takes aim at the idea of affirmative action and quotas or reverse racism for the same exact reason, and makes the point that you really can't make the first half of the argument without also rejecting the forms of discrimination against whites, Asians, etc., or pro minority discrimination. So she's spot on in her argument. Two observations. One, it was very similar to Zora Neale Hurston's argument. Zora Neale Hurston is the beloved author of And Their Eyes Were Watching God. But in her memoir, she makes the point that both racial shame and racial pride just make no sense because if as a Jewish person you feel some pride because Einstein invented physics, well, you had nothing to do with that. The fact you happen to belong to the same tribe as this brilliant person should not make you feel pride. In fact, it smacks of a kind of substitute, a cheap substitute for the things you might actually want to have pride in, such as the achievements you've made as an individual. By the same token, to feel ashamed that certain members of your group behave badly makes no sense either because you've got no control over that. And so Ayn Rand makes the exact same point that Zora Neale Hurston makes. And then, secondly, I found it interesting she was making the arguments against quotas and against affirmative action as early as 1963, because most of the writing on that subject, it's hard to find that many public intellectuals and writers opposing affirmative action that early, because it hadn't even really been implemented yet at the federal level until the Nixon administration, really. And so, in a way, she was sort of 5 to 10 years ahead of her time in making the argument against affirmative action, and I thought that spoke very highly of her.
I mentioned before setting that up, I mentioned John McWhorter, and another person whose work connected to race that I've been refollowing closely is Glenn Lowry. I'm sure you I know you've talked to both of them. One of the things I wanted to connect this to is I've been impressed with their work in trying to ascertain what is the state of racism today. And I think in your book, one of the things I appreciate about it is you take great care to avoid overstating the problem, which I think a lot of people do, but also not understating the problem, which I think is, to speak candidly, I think, say 20 years ago, my view was really, I just didn't understand the state of racism as it actually was. And I think I was maybe had rose colored glasses that it was better than it was. And my views really changed over the years. And one thing I've come to realize is it's really hard to figure out where things actually stand. And I'm curious how you think of it today. What compared to the kind of things we hear in a lot of the media that America is just wall to wall racist, and that there's no ground on which you cannot be racist. Versus, what do you actually think is going on, and what are some of the distortive aspects of people's views that you see going on today?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It is tough to measure empirically the amount of racism in society. We've had polls going back a long time. Those polls show about 5 to 10% of Americans will agree with just outright racist statements about black inferiority, or I wouldn't want my kid to marry a black person, etc. That's about 10%. 5 to 10% of the public will check those boxes of just being straight up old school racists. Um, at the same time, there are a lot of people that don't believe any of that stuff, or at least wouldn't cop to it on a poll, but might discriminate in their private lives in many different directions. And that's why you have callback studies. The gold standard is to send two identical resumes to the same person, one with, say, a black sounding name, one with a white sounding name, one with a Chinese sounding name, one with an Arab sounding name, and see how many replies you get. And what those studies find, and I cite the largest ever meta-analysis of those studies in my book. What it finds is that there's slightly less racism in America than there is in Europe. And the other thing they find is that, whether you're talking about black people, Indians, Arabs, or Chinese, East Asian, South Asian, you broadly get between 20 and 40% less callbacks than you would get with a white sounding name. Now, on its face, that looks like a pretty significant dose of discrimination. And it actually is. There's a considerable amount of discrimination. The subtlety, which I think a lot of people are incapable of holding two ideas at once, is that discrimination is actually a very small determinant of a person's overall success compared to all of the other things that determine success, such as your level of skills, your human capital, to use the economist term. And the way we know that is because different groups that experience the same amounts of labor market discrimination occupy totally different spots on the income spectrum. If you compare Indian Americans to Pakistani Americans, there's a huge income gap, yet an employer couldn't tell them apart. You compare Chinese Americans to Hmong Americans, there's a huge income gap as well. You compare different white ethnic groups, compare white Americans of Russian descent to white Americans of French descent. There's a disparity of something close to 80 cents on the dollar. You compare Nigerian Americans to Haitian Americans. Nigerian Americans do better than the average American. And so the fact that different groups that both experience the same levels of discrimination nevertheless occupy literally opposite poles on the income spectrum from the highest quintile to the lowest suggests that racial discrimination is not a very powerful determinant of group outcomes. Because if it were, we'd expect to find groups that experience lots of discrimination uniformly on the low end of the spectrum. And that's the opposite of what we find.
I want to shift gears to talk about some of the arguments that you take on from the neo-racist, as you call them, the sort of intellectual vanguard of that position. And a couple of things that really leapt out at me is that so you challenge this conception of systemic racism, that it's a complicated issue, and I've heard different arguments about what that concept might be pointing to. I'm curious how you think of it, and then relating that to the issue that you brought up earlier, which is that neo-racism or the sort of anti-racists are actually a kind of racism, and they're taking dominating cultural institutions. So in a certain way, the people who are claiming to fight racism are pushing it into really important institutions, so academia, news, media, and so forth. So I'm curious to just understand a bit more how you see that as an influence today, and then we can come back to systemic racism if you want.
Yeah, so I guess two parts to that question. One is systemic racism. Um, Systemic racism is a tricky subject. It's rarely defined. It's one of these phrases that people say over and over again. And sometimes I suspect they don't even quite know what they're saying when they say it. So the original, my at least my understanding, the original idea of systemic racism comes from the book Black Power, written in 1967. They called it institutional racism, and they defined it as, for example, a landlord that exploits you because you're black, or a real estate agent that steers you to a different neighborhood because you're black. In other words, what they meant by institutional racism was just racism that was nonviolent. In other words, it's not the KKK burning a cross on your lawn or lynching you. It's just a human being racist towards you in a perhaps subtle and nonviolent way. Over time, that idea, which is very easy to understand, and there's lots of evidence to prove that that kind of thing does still happen, um, that has morphed into this idea that racism is like a gas that just fills up the whole space of the country, even if you can never see it. It's like carbon monoxide. It's like a colorless, odorless gas, and you don't need to prove that it's there. You just kind of know it's there, and it's affecting everything. Um, and what it's functioned as is a way of not having to actually prove that racial discrimination is the cause of some particular problem. You can just sort of gesture at systemic racism, and say and indict a whole institution. The way that people end up doing this is they'll basically just look at a gap. They'll say, look, black people are 13% of the population, but 35-40% of people in prison. That gap is evidence of systemic racism. Now, I have a whole section of a chapter in the book dedicated to debunking this understanding of racism. Thomas Sowell has spent a whole career proving why this way of thinking, why gaps generally aren't caused by racism, but are caused by other factors. But systemic racism has basically become a synonym for Black people are 13% of the population, but not 13% of everything else. And then to get to the second half of your question, that becomes a way of justifying policies that racially discriminate in favor of Black people against white people, sometimes against Asians, sometimes against white Hispanics, but sometimes for Hispanics. Um, it becomes a justification for injecting racial discrimination into every walk of life in the name of combating systemic racism. So that's how the allegation of systemic racism actually leads to racially rigging every aspect of society, from whether you get into college to whether you get a certain job in corporate America.
I want to talk a bit about the issue of diversity, which really has leapt into people's awareness lately, and there was uh, more and more sensitivity to this issue of diversity, equity, inclusion. But just to bracket that and talk about diversity as something that has been seen as a value and in higher education. So, how do you understand that issue? Do you favor it? Do you think it's confusing? Is there some position on it that could be salvaged from sort of the conventional perspective?
So, if we're to talk about diversity in higher education specifically, I think that there is value in meeting people who are not from where you're from. I don't think that may overlap with race, but it's actually not the same thing as race. If I were to be college roommates with a Black person from a totally different reality, different part of the country, an Ethiopian, let's say, that would be that could at least be an experience of enriching diversity with, even though we're of the same race. Um, so to that extent, I'm a xenophile. I like to travel. I like to meet people from different backgrounds. I think that enriches life. Um, but higher education has to decide what it's actually about, because on the one hand, it says it's about diversity. Uh, on the other hand, it has Black only. All of these colleges, higher elite colleges, have Black only dorms. A lot of them have options of Black only graduations. Um, they essentially allow you to get on campus as a freshman and live your life in as much of a Black only experience as possible. So, how does it work? Is it that a white person, a white student, is enriched by being around Black and Hispanic and Asian students, but a Black student is hurt by being around white students, so they should be able to sequester themselves for 4 years in a Black only student dorm and a safe space? This doesn't make any sense. I've known many members of my family. Many people have actually gone to historically Black colleges and universities like Howard and Spelman and so forth. Many of them have very good experiences in an environment that is not diverse at all. So, one question I have is diversity a value for white people but not for non-whites? And how does that work? Um, More broadly, if we're going to talk about diversity in the workplace, um, if I'm going to hire someone to run my podcast, I don't care what race that person is. I'm trying to get the best person for the job. Most jobs benefit from getting the most competent people and not paying attention to what race they are. Now, I would grant there are some jobs where you need a racially diverse workforce in order to do the job. For example, if the NYPD were all white, that would be a huge problem, because the police need to be viewed as legitimate by the community. And if the community sees a bunch of white guys, it's going to be actually harder for the police to do their job. But I would argue most jobs are much more like firefighting than they are like policing. If you're hiring a firefighter, you just want to get the most competent people from the job. It doesn't matter what they look like. The fires don't care. I think most jobs are more like firefighting than policing, in that they don't rely on the perceived legitimacy of the community necessarily in order to do their jobs. And so I think it's a um, legitimate right of employers to think pretty uniquely and solitarily about competence and not about racial diversity.
In the time we have remaining, I want to be conscious of your schedule. A couple more questions, and I'm going to read something to you from the book that resonated with me really strongly. Maybe you can help us understand, help the audience understand where you're coming from on this. So you have something you call the forgiveness treadmill. I'm going to read back some of your words to you. Quote, sometimes the ability to continue demanding the apology is worth more than the apology itself. Sometimes the debt is worth more unpaid than paid. Close quote. I thought that was really insightful. I'm curious how you think of that, and just maybe you could give us the context around which that arises in your thinking about this issue.
Yeah, so there's a long-standing trend among so-called anti-racist thinkers to say that America doesn't care about its past. America doesn't want to atone for slavery. America doesn't even want to educate people about slavery. Um, America has never issued an apology for slavery. America hasn't done anything really by way of atonement or reparations. Now, let's actually look at the record. In 2004, the Senate officially apologized for lynching. In 2008 and 2009, both houses of Congress individually apologized for slavery and Jim Crow. At least 9 or 10 different individual states have issued formal apologies for slavery. We have a museum in Washington, D.C., a Smithsonian Museum, African American History Museum, that opened, I believe, in 2016 with an extensive exhibit on slavery in the Middle Passage, and they had to keep people out because it was overflowing with interest. Um, the idea that we don't care about our past is completely out of step with the evidence. Even affirmative action, which has been justified in the name of diversity for most of its lifetime, originally in the 60s often went by the name compensatory justice because it was not about diversity at that time. It was about compensating Black Americans for past discrimination. So it's not that America hasn't done anything in the spirit of reparations. It's that everything that has been done is immediately forgotten the moment that it's done. Now, why is that? If someone is demanding in good faith that you make an apology, and then you make the apology, and then they have amnesia the next day and keep shifting the goalposts, or conveniently forget that the apology was made, you have to understand that they don't actually want the apology. That what they want is the power that comes from the fact that you haven't apologized. Or let's say the power that comes from the perception you haven't apologized. The power that comes from the perception that there is still a debt owed. If we were to actually pay reparations for slavery to every Black person, every Black descendant of slaves, I can guarantee you within a week, you would be seeing op-eds in the New York Times talking about how actually that wasn't enough at all. And how dare you think you could pay off the debt of slavery with a single check? The goalpost would be moved automatically. You could actually see this in microcosm in the election of Barack Obama. Leading up to it, almost everyone said there is no way a Black president named Barack Hussein Obama can get elected in this country. Why? Because we're too racist. We're not ready for that yet. Boom, he gets elected 2 terms. And almost within moments of the election, the same intellectual class that said he couldn't get elected because that would be evidence we've moved further than we have said, actually, don't you think that this means Don't go thinking this means anything. We're still just as racist as we were yesterday. We haven't made any progress. And so essentially, they just pocket the gain that was made to look impossible 2 seconds ago and shift the goalpost. You also saw this happen with. I'm going on long on this, but it's important to realize what that a game is being played. You also saw this happen with the federal holiday Juneteenth. There was a USA Today article in sometime in 2020, I think, which argued we should make Juneteenth a federal holiday. Now, I agreed with this. I think it absolutely makes sense to have a federal holiday celebrating the end of slavery. It's one of the most important moments in American history. However, the article said it's going to be super hard for us to pass this, presumably because there's so much resistance to historical soul searching in this country, right? Fast forward a few months, the bill to make Juneteenth a federal holiday breezes through Congress with almost no opposition. We've been now celebrating Juneteenth for 3 years. No one will ever remember that it was considered at one point to be a difficult proposition, right? Because of the moment something is done, acknowledging slavery as a concession or validation to the demands being made, it's instantly forgotten. That's not a real good faith exchange. That's a game. And so people have to realize that this is the game that's being played with reparations and every related issue.
Coleman, a couple of last thoughts I want to put before you. One is in one of your articles, it might be in the book, I'm not remembering exactly, you say you call race a nefarious concept. And I wanted to see what you think of it and in connection with the work. I don't know if maybe you've read his work. Thomas Chatterton Williams has a really powerful book about his experiences as a father. And the thrust of that book is, as I took it, is it's time to move away from this concept. It's not helpful. It's actually more divisive than people realize. I'm curious your view of it. So you call it nefarious. Are you in line with the view that he's putting forward, that it's better to move away from it, maybe think of another way to think of ourselves in other terms, more maybe as individuals rather than members of races? I just wanted to sound you out on that perspective, if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, Thomas is a brilliant writer who I broadly agree with. Our friend Camille Foster goes even further, and actually, he does not refer to himself as black. He refers to himself as, Camille, or if you want to call him ethnically Jamaican, he would be fine with that, and as a human being. But he does not identify as black. He'll correct you if he's called black. My approach to it has been that, I'm the convention of the time I'm born into is that I'd be referred to as half black, half Hispanic, or half Puerto Rican, if you prefer, or Afro Latino, if you prefer. These labels don't mean very much to me. I don't think they say anything deeper about who I am other than where the majority of my ancestors used to live. And I'm fine for people to use these labels so long as they understand that they don't mean anything, right? They don't mean anything deep about a person's identity, about their beliefs, about their character, about their values. As long as we understand that they're superficial, I'm fine for them to be used. But the problem is people believe that they stand in for deeper character traits, right? Robin DiAngelo, in her book, she writes that um, she strives to be less white. What does it mean to try to be less white? It could only mean anything if you think that whiteness is a stand-in for character traits. And she goes on to list the character traits she has in mind. Striving to be less white means striving to be less ignorant, for example, she says. These are pernicious ideas. Any idea which equates race with a character trait is that those are the ideas that we have to that we have to get past. So broadly, I do think that race, it's inherently divisive, but that divisiveness wouldn't be a problem if people didn't invest it with deeper meaning. If people just viewed it, the point Sam Harris makes, if people just viewed it as similar to hair color, well, hair color is in theory could be divisive, but it's just that everyone knows that it doesn't mean anything, whether you're blonde, brunette, whether you have black hair, whether you have red hair, etc. So it's the mere fact of categorization, I suppose, is not really the problem. It's the investment people make in it.
So I wanted to close out the conversation by asking you to give us, in a nutshell, your vision for a way forward. So if the arguments for colorblindness that you're putting forward, the space you're creating for people to advocate for this and to hold these views, what are some of the key things you want to see happen? What would you encourage people to do to move us forward?
Well, first, I would encourage you to redouble or find your commitment to colorblindness in your own life. That is with your friends and family, and in your own beliefs. And I think there are also things that we can do at the level of policy to minimize and get rid of many of the racial triaging that we have. Richard Hanania has a book where he makes a recent book where he makes many recommendations about how to get race out of the essentially the system of federal race triage that we have that's developed over the past 50 years. Some of that has to do with executive orders that can be reversed. Others of that has to do with the Supreme Court. I think overturning affirmative action was a great choice, and so there's lots of things that can be done on the public policy front to undo, to a large extent, the the system of sort of mandated racial discrimination that has slowly taken hold over the past 50 years, mostly through bureaucracies, the federal bureaucracy, and judicial decisions, than through actual law. Most of it's happened through undemocratic means, and it can therefore, in principle, be undone through those same means. But also, we need a wider cultural change. We need more people to become confident enough to say in public, I am pro colorblindness. I try to treat people without regard to race, and I don't want race anywhere in my public policy. I don't want to be enshrining racial discrimination in my public policy. And I don't want to vote for it. I don't want to stand for it. So we need, I guess I would say, three levels. One is the personal level of your own life. One is at the level of, executive orders, bureaucratic decisions, and so forth. And one is at the level of the culture.
Well, Coleman Hughes, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I appreciate the book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. I learned a lot. The End of Race Politics: Arguments for a Colorblind America. I wish you well with that.
Thanks very much.